Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. Today we're looking at the top 10 decks for the World Championships 2019. It's happening in 2 weeks time, and yeah, I've been putting a lot of testing in this format. I think because there has been a rotation, we have a limited card pool, so it really does make for an interesting Worlds, combining both an influx of new cards as well as the reduction of our overall card pool to in many cases weaken a lot of archetypes and make them less viable. So let's take a look at the 10 that I believe are going to be the strongest builds to take to the World Championships. Starting off at number 10, I have Turbo Rayquaza. I actually profiled this yesterday, and I do think it has some legs to it. Now, its matchup spread doesn't look phenomenal, but this is one archetype that just does what it says on the tin. There's a lot of decks on here that might have better matchup spreads, but they don't work as often as Rayquaza. That's the biggest issue here. Ray, at the very least, gets going every game. You have 4 Cherish Ball, you have 4 Mysterious Treasure, you get Stormy Windsing early, you put pressure on the opponent. And if any archetype has a slow turn 1 or 2, this is the best archetype in the game at punishing them, because the more energy that gets on the field, the more dangerous this archetype becomes, and its output becomes insane. So don't really look at the matchup spread right now. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's only at the 10 spot and not any higher. But it's kind of like misleading that you have a lot of unfavorables. Like, I think the main thing to note is the close matchups. The Mew 3 matchup, the PIKAROM matchup, and reshizard. These are big scalps to take at Worlds. I think these are going to be some of the popular decks for sure. And being toe-to-toe with them is really good. So it means you have a chance at beating them if you hit giant bombs at the right time and stuff, which is pretty good. BRELOOM FROSLASS is one of the ones on the top 10. It's not like a huge scalp to take, really, but it's definitely a matchup that you would probably find yourself favored against, because you have an army of Nagas that you can go for, as well as Shaman, and then like drop a late Rayquaza and be difficult for them to deal with. For unfavorables, I've put BLACEPHALON. I think usually they will be faster than you. You have very similar sort of engines going. You're both trying to use Nagas to power up energy cards. You're both trying to use a GX in the active to take one-shots. But I think Blounds usually can do things like burst in the opening turn, so you can't skew the prize trade quite as easily by putting a non-GX in the active, and they should be able to do that if they really need to as well, which is a bit of an issue. Giant Bomb doesn't become a factor, really. You can put 10 counters on it and then attack with your Naga, but at the same time, they've probably already bursted on like turn 1 or something, so it acts as a 2-prize Pokemon anyway, so I think that's a pretty bad matchup. Malamar can be pretty tricky. Obviously, Malamar's one of those things where it depends which build we're talking about here. I think you don't want to see Spell Tag, like basic Mali. I think maybe seeing Tina Chomp is the one you want to see the most, and Ultra would be pretty even. But I think the Spell Tag Mali would be one that's slightly unfavourable, and Dark Box as well doesn't feel too good, even if you do Giant Bomb on a turn where they go for something like a Sabletar knockout. You don't really care, like they don't care that they've just taken 10 damage counters, because they're probably just going to need to like attack one more Rayquaza to win the game. They can literally wait until they have 2 Sabletars and just use both of them to win the game. So I think that'll be pretty unfavourable. Also, they could try and do some Darkrai Umbreon shenanigans as well to slow us down, so something to bear in mind. For very unfavourables, we don't have any outs to SHEDINJA, and Whimsicott is obviously going to have type coverage and force us to flip coins, which again is terrible, and the Giant Bombs have no effect on Whimsicott basically, because we would have to attack with a Rayquaza regardless. So let's jump into the list. Also, obviously, bear in mind that the community vote is there as well, but I do group decks in this top 10, but I don't group the decks in the post that I made on the Facebook page. So it may look at like 22nd place, but that includes like every Malamar build, every Reshizard build, every like Mewtwo build and all that stuff. So although it is ranked pretty low and not received many votes, I do think it's an underrated archetype thanks to the addition of Giant Bomb. And this is actually the same 60 that I posted yesterday, so if you want to see more in-depth analysis of this archetype, you can check out that video. But yeah, let's jump on to our number 9 spot, which is actually BRELOOM and FROSLASS. This archetype has got a very simple goal in mind, and that's hit for weakness against a good portion of the meta. PIKAROM and Darkbox both fall prey to BRELOOM, in theory, thanks to typing. Reshizard and BLACEPHALON, in theory, should be pretty easy prey for FROSLASS to deal with. Now, BLACEPHALON's actually a pretty bad matchup for this deck, it turns out, because they can so easily just go for a spam of Naganadels, especially if they have the thick, like, 4/4 Naganadel line with, like, the GX. That's going to be really rough for you, and even, like, the opening turns BLACEPHALON is going to be difficult to deal with, because they'll at least burst and at least force you to like get into BRELOOM on turn 2 and do all that shenanigans, which isn't always that easy with the deck. I think this deck is one that has the best matchups on paper, possibly one or two others out there, but it's kind of bricky, so definitely bear that in mind. Non-GXs are not easy to search out on the right turns anymore, so trying to counterbalance that is going to be difficult. So I think the favourables are here are simple. You're trying to hit for weakness on some big tag teams and get up trades. I've put Mew 3 as a close matchup. You can try and do some like stalling sleep shenanigans, but you are trying to two-shot them, and if they have a good level of heal, that might be difficult for you. And if they play the Greninja GX that can put itself back into the deck with Haze Slash, that's going to be really bad for you. So I think Mew 3 depends on what sort of tech Pokemon they have. Some other unfavorables, like I said, Turbo Ray will be similar to Blounds, where they'll try and use a Naga army. Whimsicott's very awkward, although you can try and sleep them for like a good amount of times, and they don't play many switching cards. You're oftentimes not doing any damage to them. And Malamar, in theory, is unfavorable. I've only put it at unfavorable and not very unfavorable, because I'm teched pretty heavily for Mali in the build, so something to bear in mind. It's got a few more votes from the community, so it's definitely one that's on some people's radars. And once again, we have no answer to Shedinja right now, so in theory, they should do very well against us. We don't have much hand disruption outside of reset stamps. That could be like our only way of beating them. But again, we're like this kind of slow archetype, and if they're not attacking our BRELOOMs, it makes life even more difficult for us to get back into the active, use a Mareep to force sleep on the opponent. So Shedinja, just because they're not taking knockouts against us, makes this actually a very hard matchup for us, so something to bear in mind. Onto the Pokemon. This is actually a vastly different build from the one that I've posted. I posted a BRELOOM list with Amoonguss, and now I've gone more towards the Mareep line, simply for space. Opening up these spaces means that we can play this FROSLASS and have a better time against the Fire decks, which is definitely relevant. I think BRELOOM wouldn't be that strong against reshizard otherwise, because again, they're a deck that plays mixed herbs and great potions and all this stuff, which is very ugly for you. So having a FROSLASS for at least one big one-hit-KO is pretty mandatory in my eyes for that matchup to be reasonable. And you can see I've dedicated 4 spaces just to having a better time against Malamar, and that's the new Hooper in a 3 count, as well as Absol. Absol shutting down the nice escape board Jirachi pivot that pretty much every Malamar's playing now, I would say. And even if they're not playing Jirachi, like oftentimes they use a skateboard to pivot on things like their Dedenne or on an Inkay or something like that. So Absol is really annoying for Malamar in particular, but also good against anything that's going to be playing a Jirachi engine, which a handful of decks on this top 10 do. So something to bear in mind. Absol plus Hooper in a very high count is trying to give us a reasonable, winnable Malamar in theory. Also, we're playing one Buzzmosa GX, and that could also be a cheeky thing we can try and use against some opponents to take some extra prize cards in non-GX v non-GX matchups. If you can set up a nice Beast Game GX, you can get a nice prize up against them. So that's the hope we can have against some other non-GX builds, which we're not necessarily like covered against. The Buzzmosa is a really nice tech for that option. For the trainers, it's pretty simplistic. I'm playing double reset stamp. It's good for a number of reasons, but especially late game when you're trying to have the slumbering forest combo. Reset stamp is really, really nice, and it can literally buy you that last turn to close out the game. And other than that, there's not too much spice up in here other than Hapu as a supporter. And really, it's just because there's no actual discard in the entire archetype. There's no discarding cards in the deck, apart from these 2 Hapus that I've jammed in. And the reason why we play these is there are matchups where FROSLASS isn't good. There are matchups when Hooper and Absol are not good. There are matchups when BRELOOM isn't even that good. So you want to have some discard for these Pokemon. Like, yes, you can communication them back in like the entire game, but they'll still end up watering down your deck. So having Hapus to discard some of these excess pieces is really important. So I think that's a card that you like shouldn't cut from the list at all. For other options, Viridian Forest could be an extra like discarding card and give us good outs to grass energies. It might make you want to play 1 water. A Custom Catcher could be really nice. BRELOOM is good at knocking out Dedennes, and also just targeting the tag team that you want, which is pretty nice. And a further option is Tapu Fini. Maybe this can help out against the BLACEPHALON archetype, which is surprisingly difficult. But then again, they should be attacking with Nagas against you, so I don't think that's necessarily all that viable. But it could help you like get a couple of prizes ahead in the opening game at the very least, and then you're trying to claw back with BRELOOMs later on. So could be a nice option for this deck. But yeah, this is the closest thing to like an anti-meta toolbox, because we're trying to have 2 good type coverages and then Hooper Absol to cover Malamar, which is typically this deck's like worst matchup and kind of like the key reason why people aren't playing FROSLASS BRELOOM right now, outside of consistency reasons. On to number 8, we have SHEDINJA. This had a good amount of votes in the community as well, and it's definitely an archetype that is definitely kind of a boogeyman. No one really wants to face this build. There's only a handful of archetypes that has a good time against this deck, and even then they can still end up losing. So I think this build, like, you can see the very favourables. Some decks just say, well, if you're playing SHEDINJA, I guess I lost this game. Like BRELOOM, Turbo Ray, Whimsicott, reshizard, like outside of maybe reset stamps, these archetypes has no reason to be able to beat SHEDINJA outside of just them bricking and you donking them or something. So SHEDINJA will just take wins at Worlds, like maybe a free round or two here or there. But for everyone else, it's a real hard grind. And the main reason this deck isn't higher isn't because it's like bad, it's because the physical playing of SHEDINJA for the amount of rounds you'll have to play in sometimes high pressure situations if you're on winning ins and stuff, and the fact that you won't have any lunch breaks, it is an exhausting deck to play, and to not make any mistakes for that amount of time in a real tournament situation is actually difficult. So you have to be very well practiced with SHEDINJA if you want to take it to Worlds, in my opinion. You can't just pick up this list and roll with it. Obviously this is going to give you a good starting point, the list that I show. But you may still want to make your own adaptations from your own testing, and even then you need to be very adept with the 60 cards. You can't just jam these in sleeves and roll with it, because you really need to play well and quickly if you want to win within 50 minutes, because otherwise you tie, and at Worlds a tie is basically a loss. So you really don't want to tie with this deck, and it's very able to tie if your opponent is trying to use the clock to their advantage. That's going to be a problem for you, because it takes you so long to physically win games. For the unfavourables, Dark Box, obviously with the Saboteur, GX attack is very bad for you. PIKAROM having Lysander Labs, usually mained in their deck, as well as custom catchers, as well as a sniping attack, which can take a knockout and forcing you to play with one less bench. Like, although the snipe is a big deal, like even if you have Mew down like the entire game, that's still eating up a slot that could be another Ninkada or another Sprint. So just putting a Mew down on the board is already like an awkward thing for you. Malamar is kind of good for you. I think it's pretty okay. I think you don't mind seeing a Malamar for the most part, especially if you're playing Champs Festival. It should be all right. BLACEPHALON, I think is only reasonably favourable, depending on if they tech for you. Like, they can add in Mewtwo, Magcargo if they really want to. But I don't think many people will be doing that at Worlds, to be honest. Onto the list, it has slightly changed from the 60 that I posted earlier in the week. I've changed a couple supporters around. I added in the Koga's Trap and the Shrine, because I think these are important cards to really accelerate your win condition of damaging people out, because you definitely want them to lose in 50 minutes, and oftentimes taking prizes is the fastest way that that can happen. So I ate into the Poker Gear and Poker Nav counts a little bit. They are consistency cards, it does hurt a little, but adding in Shrine and Koga's I think does speed up this build a lot. The other thing I changed was I cut one Hapu to add in a Looker, so that you're a little bit safer against Stamp. Looker can actually be the supporter that you end up recycling a bunch alongside Lieutenant Surge, so that you can get back the 3 cards that you literally just resourced back in the deck, guaranteed. So those are the few changes that I've made, but overall I'm pretty happy with the shell that I came up with, and I think it's pretty close to the mark. So let me know what you think of this build. For other options, Power Plant is a potential stadium if you're going to try any like trapping shenanigans against like Pikaroms maybe, or a handful of other archetypes like the Dark Box deck. You can just try and jam Power Plant at them and maybe make it difficult for them to Saboteur, but eventually they'll find a counter stadium, I imagine. Latios GX and Psychic Energy could be another interesting tech option. Just shut down the GX attack from opponents. You can maybe make the Latios the space instead of the Mew, knowing that this can help out against Pikarom, and also knowing that you can have a much better time against Dark Box. These are 2 GX attacks that are a big problem for you, and it even shuts down the Mewtwo opportunity of them having Magcargo in the build. So Latios can cover your bases against a lot of scary things that people will try and do to end up decking you out as one of their win conditions. So Latios could be an option. It does force you towards Psychic Energies, which is actually a little bit annoying because fires are like the best energies to play for basic energy because you can have Heat Factory and you can have Big Oven on your side. So it's a small downside, but I think the Latios is a good combo if you're actually scared of some of these GX attack options, and it turns your deck from being like taking a few tactical losses of matchups to trying to cover all your bases. But I think if you do want to play the Latios, you probably need to also play a Super Scoop Up or a Giovanni's to get it out of the way again. Because it is a bench space that can be eaten up by this card, and it's obviously a 2-price Pokemon. If people are going to gust it, that could be the difference against you, so something to bear in mind. And also, if you want to try, instead of the Mars build, you could, well, Mars and Persian, you can try having Diglett, Giovanni's, and then have a Dedenne in the build as well. Dedenne being a nice Pokemon communication target to get you into, an opportunity to find an Elm all over again from a fresh 6. And Giovanni being able to reuse that Diglett for destroying your opponent's deck, whilst also clearing up the bench for you as well. So those are a few avenues for Shedinja. I do think it's powerful, but it really does ask a lot of the player piloting it if you do want to do well at Worlds. And if you do well at day 1, like, you then have to go through another like X amount of rounds day 2 to go like deep into the tournament. So it's like, yes, you can do well with this deck, but you can do well with a lot of decks, and this is the one that makes you play perfectly the entire time. So if you challenge yourself, maybe this is the one for you, but otherwise, I think there are easier ways for you to do well at Worlds. In at number 7, we have Whimsicott. Now, this actually also has like a really powerful matchup spread, taking a lot of favourables and only a couple ugly auto losses, I would say. Community kind of agrees it's starting to get a bit of attention. 28 votes there, and taking a good Turbo Ray is fine. A good BLACEPHALON is really appealing. Basically, every BLACEPHALON isn't playing any answer to the Fairy Charm Ultra Beast outside of possibly them playing a Mewtwo. And that's just going to be really, really good for you. So just answering BLACEPHALON instantly would be amazing. You're also pretty good against things like MALAMAR and BRELOOM if they're going to be like predominantly 2-shotting, because it's essentially a 4-shot if coin flips are averaged out to you, which makes life good for you. I think Mew 3 is also pretty reasonable. You have the ability Fairy Charm, and that forces them to just use reshizard, which isn't an attacker that they can like spam the entire time with Flare Strikes so easily. They normally only play like 2 or 3 switches. So if they're like missing those Flare Strikes, it's going to be really good for you if you get some coin flips in your favor. And obviously it shuts down like the main section of their deck, which is using good GX attackers with the Mewtwo, and you just shut that down from them immediately. Also, Dark Box I think is relatively favorable. It basically comes down to very important coin flips on like 1 or 2 turns where they're going to try and Sabletar through you. I think that's what it sort of boils down to. And that means that, like, at the very least, it's a 50-50 matchup, maybe a little bit more favorable, because you're going to have to make them coin flip 2 times, usually, unless they have fitting custom catchers, which I don't think many decks will have the room for after, like, playing it myself. A close matchup, I think, is PIKAROM. Yes, you have the Charms. They have Lysander Labs, so they can shut down that, but even on the turn that they shut down your Charm, they still have to flip heads to do any damage, and hopefully you can counter that Stadium on the turn they put down the Labs. That's the idea. So you only give them a couple of opportunities to push through your Whimsicott. And again, just some critical coin flips on a turn or 2 in the game. And then some unfavorables, no answer to Shedinja, and Reshizard is easily like the worst matchup. They're playing Power Plants in high counts, and that's just going to like tear through the Whimsicott deck, which is what it's all about, really trying to get that fluffy cotton working the entire time and trying to get Charms in your favor. Onto the list, I don't think there's... Oh, it has actually changed a little bit from the list that I posted. I ended up cutting the Alolan Ninetales and added in 2 of the new two copies of the new Whimsicott, the non-GX. It's a free retreater, and also it can go ahead and grab you any card, and that's good for trying to find your rare candy combos. It's good for just getting you into like some certain energies in the mid game as well, which is pretty reasonable. It can also pick out things like Diantha or the Fairy Charm that you need. So these are some nice critical one-offs that the Whimsicott can help out with, as well as being like reasonable early game consistency to help getting you into just like toy box turns and stuff like that, which is something to bear in mind. I've also added in the Mew with that space from the Alolan Ninetales. Even though we do have this Fairy Charm, I think being extra safe against PIKAROM is just probably worth it for Worlds. So the Mew seems pretty good. Not much else has changed from the initial list. I still like playing Viridian Forest and some basic fairies, because it just gives you better outs to Toy Box. A couple other options we could be looking towards. Wondrous Labyrinth is a great Prism Star card that I'm currently not playing because it doesn't help the overall like game plan of the deck. It's just like a random disruption turn that you just hope sticks. Maybe combining it with Reset Stamp is like a cool play that you can try and do. But it feels very niche, and overall, like, the Viridian is just pretty good. But I can see putting in a third stadium in the list as well, and that would also be pretty reasonable for more outs against Lysander Labs. And then Custom Catcher could be a card you could think about trying to squirm into the deck. It's just always a thing that you want to add into lists because although we are a reasonable beat stick, we are limited with the amount of triple accelerations that we can use in a game. So we only have to like pick our moments for good burst damage. Usually we're just sat around the like 130 mark with one of our fair energies and a bunch of recycle energies, and then when it's time to push, we will start slapping the 3Cs down and going for big knockouts. But if you play custom catchers, you can time these like a lot better for some targets on your opponent's side of the field, and that could be a pretty good option. But right now, I'm not really sure there's much space in already a stage 2 plus stage 1 deck. Trying to fit in the customs may be a little bit too greedy, and that's why it's currently not in the list at least. In at number 6, we have Mewtwo and Mew Tag Team. I think this archetype is pretty solid, but its matchup spread isn't great. I think the build is similar to like Turbo Ray, really, where it's like one of the most consistent builds out there. We have great searchability for it, as well as like most of its targets that you'll be trying to copy. And it is also able to take advantage of the best energy acceleration in the game, which is Welder. And it can also use reshizard. So I think the archetype has like a lot going for it in a vacuum. It's just its matchup spread isn't the best. Malamar being an unfavorable is one that really scares me, because I think Malamar will be very popular and I rate it pretty highly. Also, BLACEPHALON is one that I'm not too big of a fan of taking the L to just naturally, because BLACEPHALON is also a strong contender. So I think already if like 2 of the maybe top 5 decks, let's say, well, you know, you haven't seen them yet and they're on a top 10 list, right? So if 2 of the top 5 decks in the format are bad matchups, that's already looking pretty ugly for you. Whimsicott also being like a pretty awkward one. Close matchups, we do potentially have an Archer to SHEDINJA if we choose to. I think the list I'm going to show doesn't, but if you want to add in the Magcargo GX, you can have a reasonable matchup there. Turbo Ray I think is pretty close. BRELOOM, FROSLASS also like a relatively close one. We have some healing, but not like a huge amount, and not a huge amount of switching cards either. And reshizard is also a close matchup. They're going to try and do some power plant stamp options, but at the same time, if we prepare accordingly and just have our own reshizards on board ready to attack with as well, at least power plant doesn't shut down our entire deck, and we can still use things like outrage and flare strike against them with the physical reshizards that we are playing. So it's kind of like a reshizard mirror when you're up against the greens build of reshizard, and I think that's a mirror that like we still can win, so something to bear in mind. I don't think you just get stonewalled by power plant because we are still playing 2 reshizards on our own end. And for some favourables, Darkbox and PIKAROM, these guys both get hit with Latios GX, and that's really good for you. PIKAROM oftentimes doesn't have many non-GX attackers, sometimes it's Zapdos, sometimes it's none. And Darkbox is similar. They can attack with things like Weavile and Naganadel, but Naga is basically like losing a lot of energy cards, as is the Weavile. If they're going to just attack into you, then you can like mix up and do a different attack for a 1-hit KO, and that can be really ugly for them because they can lose a bunch of energy cards, and it essentially skews their like main approach, which is going to be trying to use some Sabletar action for some big like up trades and stuff. So I think these are matchups you can definitely win out against them, so something to bear in mind. Onto the list, and I've actually moved away from a Jirachi based build. It's where I initially started off with this deck, but I actually like forcing the opponent to take a hard 6 prizes basically, and I oftentimes found with Jirachi they would pick off Jirachi, and if they had like in the early game sometimes you just leave a sleeping Jirachi just to get some extra hand advantage, and then they can pick off things like the Dene and whatnot, which actually gets pretty ugly. So now you try and make them have the actual task of going through 2 big tag teams, even with like great potions on top of that. We're going to try and make it a hard slog for them. We play 3 Mewtwo, we play a couple of Reshizard. For the sort of split of attackers we're going to try and copy, we have Latios GX in here, which is a huge wall for those two tag teams that I've already mentioned, PIKAROM matchup and as well as the Dark Box matchup. It can even be good against reshizard, of course. Like on the turns they're not power planting, there's nothing wrong with trying to use the Mewtwo like in the mid game. There's then Solgaleo for energy acceleration. He's like the least searchable of our options alongside Greninja. Because they can't be treasured, but they still have some really good attacks. Solgaleo, a 2 energy attack that can accelerate. Dragonite has a big 1-hit KO option. Greninja also has a 2 energy attack for 130, which is a really good baseline to be hitting. And it also shreds. It gets through anything, so you can beat quad Keldeo decks, and you can beat like opposing Mewtwo's using Latios against you and stuff, so that Greninja is really useful. And Naganadel coming in from Unified Minds. I'm not sure if this is the set symbol, by the way, UMI or whatever. I imagine it might be, though. But yeah, some good sniping opportunities is good with this card. Not too much else to say about the trainers in the list. I think Coach Trainer is the only one that you might bat your eyelids at. I was checking out an article from Tablemon, Pablo. He was playing like a full 4 copies of Coach Trainer. I don't believe in it quite that much, but I do think it's a reasonable card you can have in this build to top up your hand. It synergizes with Welder, right? You're trying to grow your hand with trying to spam Giant Half, trying to spam Welder, and trying to use Coach Trainer in some turns. The only thing I did do was I changed 2 of the Coach Trainers for 2 Hapus to give you a little bit of extra discard synergy cards, so that you're not just using your Cherish Balls to then treasure them immediately away and whatnot. So I think with the 4 treasure and now the 2 Hapus alongside the 3 Giant Half, I think we have plenty of discard synergy for getting these GXs in the bin as quickly as possible for Mewtwo to copy. There are plenty of options we can go for with this archetype in terms of other additions for the deck. There's obviously a bunch of GXs, like the list is endless for cards like you theoretically could use with Mewtwo. Some of the ones that I've previously played, Altaria and Greninja, the one that can Haze Slash, those both can be, well, Altaria is an annoying like walling attack. The reason why I cut this is because its damage output is so low, and so many archetypes will have like some non-GX that they can swing into you with. Greninja can be nice for undoing a whole load of damage. Right now I'm just playing Great Potions, but it could be an option that you go for. And Magcargo is a tech card for Shedinja if you respect it. Tapu Fini, if you respect BLACEPHALON enough. I think this is naturally not a very good matchup for us. The only thing about just jamming in one Tapu Fini is we have like literally no search for it, so you just have to draw into it and use it. But it could be nice for skewing prize trade once again. If you don't believe in the draw engine that I have right now, the 2 Hapu, 2 Bills, 2 Coach Trainer, I don't blame you. So you may want to go towards more stereotypical supporters, I guess is the best way to put it. And if you want to go heavier on the tanking, you could try and weave in something like Choice Helmet and or Mixed Herbs for some extra healing and extra tank ability, because you are going to be very similar to like essentially old ability Reshizard, where you try and make them take the hard prizes to win the game. And that's essentially what this build is going to go for. If you do want to play Jirachi boards, it does make it much easier for you to accumulate custom catchers. It does really help out at picking out some like key supporters on those opening turns. Just giving you better outs to Welder is really good as well. So, I mean, I don't hate the Jirachi build either. But again, it's one of these cards that's like not all that searchable. You kind of just have to find him, use him when you can. And he's not like the best in the deck, but he's still like pretty reasonable if you want to. Just bear in mind that if you are up against decks that can gust, you shouldn't really leave your Jirachi in the active in those opening turns. It's better for you to just like let something else get hit instead. Otherwise, they can easily like gust to Dene for game, which is something that I found happened to me a couple of times. In at number 5, we have Dark Box. The community are pretty much behind me on this one. They have a lot of votes around the archetype, and there is potential for so much to happen with this build. It's all sort of given to us in this new set. Both the new sort of flagship tag teams of Darkrai Umbreon and Mega Sableye Tyranitar, as well as the Weavile himself, all comes from this new set, and a lot of people are hyped on the build, and I think it's pretty reasonable as well. It's got a very good Shedinja matchup, and just naturally not having to worry about that is just a big thumbs up from me. You literally don't have to commit any spaces to have a good Shedinja, and that's already like such a big selling point, I would say. Also, you're pretty good against Turbo Ray, which is nice, and pretty much every like regular GX deck you're pretty reasonable against, because you can sort of take that additional prize with Sabletaur so easily, and then you just need to like take one more GX knockout to win. So it's essentially like you're against 180 hit point tag teams, and like that's such a good thing for you to have, really. That's why the BLACEPHALON matchup is kind of close. I found it okay. You do have plenty of ways to skip B-String. I'm currently not playing Gusting though, so it's not as easy as you would think. And at the same time, BLACEPHALON's one of those decks that just sort of keeps you honest. It bursts early. It'll do Bursting Burn to like force you to have switching cards from your tag teams and stuff like that while you're just waiting for the amount of energy to hit the field or whatever. And they can still like reach big numbers with just an army of naggers and welders without the need for beast string, even if you are able to skip it, which isn't always that easy, especially because they put it on a clock so well. So I think that one's close. I think you're close against the other two tag teams as well, like reshizard and PIKAROM. These matchups really sort of depend on, well, the reshizard is about power plant and their timing of plant plus stamp, because that can obviously be something to bear in mind. So you really need to make the use out of Weavile like on the turns that you have it, and you need to make sure you have your counter stadiums at the ready. We are playing 4 in the build, so we have plenty of counter stadium opportunities. But at the same time, like very often if they just take a knockout on a tag team whilst playing a reset stamp, you'll have to use like Naga to charge up energies, and then you have to still find Weavile to get into your next attacker, so something to bear in mind. That's kind of the back and forth that you two will have. PIKAROM is much more of an aggressive build. It's basically if you can actually get enough Poipols and Nagas down to keep up with the PIKAROM and trying to use Darkrai Umbreon to cleverly put your damage counters in the right places so that they are limited with the amount of attackers they have available to them. Otherwise, Saboteur can literally just announce 2 attacks and win the game, so that's normally what it's all about. Malamar I've also found to be close. If they're spell tagged like basic Mali, that's probably like the easiest matchup of the bunch, because you have resistance naturally to them and you have very tanky tag teams that can buy a lot of turns. If they are the other two more heavy hitting Malamar builds, Ultra and Tina Chomp, it might be a little bit more difficult for you. Again, you're going to try and make the most out of your 2 tag teams and use them both in the right spots to either set up tag teams with the Darkrai Umbreon or with Saboteur just coming in and swinging. Also, bear in mind, in literally like every matchup, deck out is an opportunity for this deck. Just the Saboteur is like a low-key win condition that stops people like digging with the deck, or at least can punish them heavily for it as well. So in all of these matchups, like you can win just by deck out if they are having to like push for like big knockouts, or if they have in the deck a lot with a bunch of Dedenne and whatnot, you can really punish them a lot, which is pretty cool as well. For unfavorables, I think Mew 3 isn't all that good for you. Again, that Latios is such an annoying attack that they can copy. Even if their damage output isn't all that high, they're just doing 100 pressure each turn. That's still enough to like get through your Sneasels and Poipols and even Nags in those opening turns, whilst also being like immune as it comes back into your turn, which is pretty ugly. BRELOOM you don't want to see, obviously with typing, and they have time to set up. We're not a fast pressure deck at all with Dark Box. Sometimes if things have gone well, you can attack with Darkrai Umbreon on turn 2, but oftentimes that requires you to find like the switching cards as well as your stage 1s of Weavile and Naga, so everything has to have gone right for you to attack on turn 2. And we never attack on turn 1 outside of like Sneaky Smash, so BRELOOM has time to set up, and that's pretty ugly for you. And Whimsicott, again, feels a little bit on the unfavourable side, because again, you give them the time of day to just do their toy box, get all their shenanigans rolling, get their stage 2 online, get a bunch of energies rolling, and also you have to flip some coins. Well, they have to flip coins poorly for you to do anything against them, so I think that's a matchup you don't really want to see too much. Onto the list, this has changed a lot from the initial 60 that I posted. I've ended up thickening the Weavile, well, at least the Sneasel count to 3, and made the Naga count to 3-3 because it is just so vital to get these down on board early. From there, I have ended up adding in ZoroNinja because it's just a nice sweep card, really, when you're oftentimes trying to finish off a tag team. And so many decks do play Mew that the Darkrai Umbreon oftentimes is trying to set up like tag team numbers, but oftentimes people can just block that against you. So Saboteur doesn't end up being a finisher, whereas the ZoroNinja can be one, which is nice. From there, not too much different with the list. I've added in 2 Switch and dropped down to 1 Night City, just for some more physical switching, and it gets around Choo Choo, of course, which is something to bear in mind. I've cut down to 1 Nanu. Obviously, he's still useful, and you will use him on things like Dedenne, and sometimes even things like Nagas in the late game or whatever. This can just be a nice one-off card. You don't need to have 2 copies, really. I only really played 2 for like access to him, but I've ended up just going towards like a more simplistic support account. But yeah, this build is like the least greedy build I could think of for Dark Toolbox at the moment. There are definitely greedier builds out there. They're playing Super Scoop Ups, they're playing Custom Catchers, playing Reset Stamps. I'm not playing any of those like big power cards and hoping that the swarm of energy is enough to win the game. But I can definitely see you trying to go towards some of those quote unquote like greedier cards so that you actually like win more against decks if you have like a hot draw. So that's basically the two kind of ways I can see this deck going. It's either the simplistic build like this, which is just saying, hey, I can probably get set up most games and my tag teams are good, hopefully these can win me the game. Or there are going to be the builds that don't set up quite as often, but then they have like some demolishing turns where they can double custom catcher a Dedenne and win game off of it by taking 3 prizes with a Sabletar. There are times when they can super scoop up a 200 damaged tag team and then move all their energies onto a new tag team. Like, there's definitely some power spikes this deck has available to it if you play the greed cards. Speaking of greed cards, also Black Market Prism could be considered. Currently not playing it. Again, it doesn't fit like the core approach of the deck, but again, it can like deny a prize here or there, which is actually pretty good for you. And then finally, Mewtwo and Mew is another option. When you're only playing 2 ofs and 1 of the Zoro Ninja, and then 2 ofs of like your other main tag team attackers, you may want to put in a Mewtwo just to help out with prizing issues, and to also give you good type coverage against like opposing Mewtwo. So could be an option for you for sure. At the moment, I don't have the room for it, but it's a card that you could definitely consider as well in the list. In at number 4, we have Reshizard. This is a very hyped archetype from the community by the looks of things. It was the number 2 voted deck with 162 votes. Now, I do think the archetype is still solid. Power Plant is just a nuts card in this format. It's very, very difficult for some decks to play around it, and it can literally buy you wins just by stalling out the opponent like early with Power Plant and really making them not draw very hot. And you can really punish that with just aggression from a Reshizard. That's pretty much how this deck can claim a lot of its wins, and even if things aren't going well for you, you have the Power Plant Stamp combo to get back into the game if you start falling behind, so that's something to bear in mind. You can easily claim Whimsicott if people are going to try and get tricky and play that for Worlds. You're pretty okay against some of the other tag team decks, like Dark Box. It's going to be a back and forth of like Stamp Power Plant as your sort of late game push, whilst you're sort of trading prizes. Mewtwo as well ends up being somewhat of a mirror match in many cases because they have to end up attacking with a Reshizard, especially late game. If they only have Mewtwo's on board late game, they will lose because you can just Stamp Power Plant them and you'll win. But they will just put down their physical Reshizards and attack with those, so it becomes somewhat of a mirror match in many cases. Turbo Ray, I think, is pretty close. Yes, they have giant bombs, but you do have healing, and again, Power Plant can shut down things like Stormy Winds and can shut down Dedennes in those opening turns. Malamar, also close. We have healing, so it can be very nice against the mainly non-GX spell tag Malamar, like the Psychic build. That's the one that you want to see the most. If you're up against Ultra or Tina Chomp, these can be slightly more difficult, I would say. But at least they are attacking with GXs in the active that you can like cash in on when you can. So something to bear in mind. PIKAROM I have slightly unfavorable, and this is just from my testing. You can end up winning a lot of games with Reshizard just by jamming the Power Plant turn 1 against them, because they oftentimes are so reliant on using Electro Radar to find Dedenne turn 1. It's like a big portion of their outs for essentially like a supporter card in air quotes, because it draws them a bunch of stuff and gets their game plan rolling whilst also binning off energies for them. So Dedenne is just so good in PIKAROM that denying that even just for one turn is like such a big deal. But the reason why I find this unfavorable nowadays is just because you can't reach on them. You have to like two-shot them a lot of the time, and that's really bad for you. You never want to be two-shotting the PIKAROMs because they have such good one-hit KO potential with Raichu now that it feels pretty slow. So again, it feels like you're on the back foot against that archetype, trying to use things like Stamp Plants to get your way back into the game, which is pretty much like the best combo that we have now. It's essentially like a Garbodor plus N combo that we have now via this deck. So Reshizard's probably like the best defensive deck you can play right now, I would say. BLACEPHALON, slightly unfavorable as well, just because they can have uptrades, which is pretty ugly for you. And BRELOOM FROSLASS, you don't want to see FROSLASS at all. FROSLASS is a very bad card for you to come up against. You can try and maybe use like the Volk to get you through them in the opening turns and whatnot, but even BRELOOM has more hit points than 110, so it wouldn't be all that effective for you. They would basically force out the attacker and then use FROSLASS against you, which is pretty ugly. And SHEDINJA is also a card that we are not teched for, so we don't have a good time against it. Onto the list itself, I think I'm like the only person playing Pheromosa in Reshizard. Let me know if you guys are actually playing a free retreat pivot, but it's been so clutch for me that I just can't cut Pheromosa. Just having 3 Switch plus 2 Pheromosa is so good. Having a natural count of 9 Pokemon rather than just the 7 if you don't play them is also very good. It just means that like if you don't have greens turn 1, you don't just end up losing by just like a Volcanion getting knocked out turn 2. So just having this higher Pokemon count has felt very good. Pheromosa can literally just poke for 20, and this is so good against PIKAROM that it's like just worth playing for that 20 poke. It means that you don't have to sit there and outrage with the Reshiram knowing that they can just tag switch into a Raichu and slap you. Pheromosa is very good, and it can just be like this 5th non-GX that you can just throw in people's faces if you're against maybe other non-GX matchups where you make them go through 5 hard prizes, then the Reshizard comes late game, and then you just try and mix turb the 1 Reshizard for the whole game. So I like the count of double Pheromosa. Let me know if you're playing any like non-GX pivot card or anything like that outside of Volcanion in the list. That's really the only like creativity, I guess you could say, in the list. I'm playing 1 Great Potion, 1 Choice Helmet alongside the 4 Mixed Herbs, trying to cash in on that tank ability as much as possible. You could go even further down the healing route if you wanted to, but I'm just making the standpoint that Power Plant wins games. I want to play 3 copies of this card. To be honest, like you could cut the Great Potion and just play a 4th Power Plant. The card is so good that you just win games off of it sometimes, and I can definitely see that being a thing. Shrine of Punishment's an option as well. This can help out against PIKAROM, but ultimately I don't find it that good against PIKAROM. It's good if they like, if you can hit one PIKAROM for 230, then they like retreat into the Choo Choo. You can definitely punish them by like hitting the new Raichu with like a switch or something, like switch back into your Reshizard, then you drop the Shrine, hit the new Pokemon for 230, whilst also the Shrine ticking to kill the benched PIKAROM would be like very good for you, but it's just so niche that like you need to have the perfect greens in hand, and it's not always like that easy to pull off. So I'm not a huge fan of Shrine in the list. I don't think it's like mandatory, but it's a card that you definitely like could be playing, and I've seen a lot of people play Shrine. I'm not like super against it, but I'm also of the opinion that you need to like draw very well to have the combo work, and the opponent has to not play around it as well. Like, why don't they just keep attacking with the PIKAROM in the active anyway, right? They could just keep doing that. And then it's like pretty rough for you. So yeah. And if you do it on the turn that you play, if you do the 230 attack, your Reshizard is then getting Shrine ticked as well, and it can mean sometimes like less Electro powers are required for them to take a one shot against you, which is also a little bit awkward. Oranguru is an option that I previously have had in the list. I cut it for a 2nd Pheromosa, believe it or not. But it can be nice for recycling Mixed Herbs. It can be nice for recycling Custom Catchers. These are some great cards that you can spam, and because of the way we can force an awkward prize trade against people, sometimes that Oranguru attack is free, basically. If it gets knocked out, we don't care, because they still have to get through 2 Reshizards. And if you have it with that approach in mind, the Oranguru can be very strong. It does require you to have already played your Mixed Herbs and your Custom Catchers in points, which doesn't always happen, and you don't have any search for the Oranguru, so that's the main reason it was cut, just for a nice free retreater. And Pokemon Fan Club's a card I've kind of seen in and around some Reshizard builds. It's pretty reasonable, especially when you're going down that non-GX army kind of route of having literally make them go through 4 Volcana Pheromosa before you even show them a Reshizard. It can be pretty nice. And in the same vein, like if you're going 2nd, you can just happily Fan Club knowing that you can just Flare Starter to a Reshizard. So it gives you extra outs to just, you know, the 4 greens and the 3 Cherish Ball to find Reshizard turn 1. So if you want to have additional outs for some basics, you can go down that route. If you do play Fan Club, you can cut to 1 Pheromosa for sure as well. You don't need 2 if you play the Fan Club, so something that you can definitely consider playing. In at number 3, we have BLACEPHALON. I think BLACEPHALON is very strong. The community also is backing it. Looks like Persian is the most popular build of many people. I'm actually in the minority here. I prefer the Naga GX build because of its simplicity, just because I think it's much more searchable personally. But Persian is still very good. Obviously, we've seen how good it can be in our previous formats where, you know, you could Nest Ball Meowth previously, of course, and stuff, which isn't the case now. But Persian obviously having that ability to get you into more B-strings or get you welder combos. Even now, it could help you get things like Reset Stamp and stuff, which is a pretty huge deal. So I'm going to be showing off a build for each of the BLACEPHALONs here. I still think the archetype is very solid. Obviously, Tapu Fini comes out of the new set, and that's a big question mark if people are actually going to commit to trying to have an answer to you. Even if they are playing Tapu Fini, it's obviously difficult for them to have it on the right turns. So although BLACEPHALON is active for like a good amount of turns in the game, the key moment to use a Tapu Fini is like the turn you go into B-String, because you force them to have B-Strings and Gust all in one turn, and that's not always very easy for them. And even if they end up with like 12 energies in play, you don't care because you've made them go for a non-GX Tapu Fini, which is normally what does happen, and it can definitely skew the prize trade for BLACEPHALON. So the Tapu Fini is a genuine concern for the deck, but finding it is a minor inconvenience for the archetypes trying to play it, and effectively they're playing one less consistency card in their deck effectively. So for natural favourables, Reshizard seems pretty good to me. Mew 3 also seems good. These are just uptrade. Like, you just have the opportunity to uptrade against them, and it's as simple as that sometimes. You just have to make your way through to tag teams, and when you have the help of B-String that they can rarely avoid, Mew 3 potentially can, depending on what attackers it tries to copy, you are going to have a good time there. Turbo Ray seems fine. You're just basically a faster version of Turbo Ray in that sense. And BRELOOM FROSLASS, you just use your army of Nagas. PIKAROM and Dark Box I found to be very close. Both of these archetypes do have the opportunity to jump B-Strings, which is a small concern. Obviously, we will be teching Mew for Worlds. You can't go in with BLACEPHALON hoping that your PIKAROM matchup is good enough without a Mew. It's definitely not. So you have to play Mew. You have the searchability for the Mew, which is a good thing because you have treasures. And sometimes Com in addition if you're playing the Persian build. So that shouldn't be a big problem for you. And again, you're trying to do the uptrades if you're able to. But just bear in mind that the PIKAROM and Sabletar and even Darkrai Umbreon can either jump B-String physically by jumping over the prizes, or if they use Darkrai Umbreon's GX attack, they can take a knockout on the active whilst also denying you from using any trainer cards, which is very ugly. For slightly unfavourables, I put Shedinja. You can tech for Shedinja if you want to. Like I said, you can play Mewtwo and Magcargo. And Malamar is a matchup that I don't really like facing either. I think the Spell Tag Mally is the one that you want to face the least. Also, the Tina Chomp Mally also plays like a high counter Spell Tag, which is pretty ugly. And they have late game like one-hit KO potential against you once they've done all their shenanigans with Giratinas the whole time. And also, I think Ultra... I think you're actually a little bit favoured against Ultra, but it's the other two Malamars that I have slightly unfavourable. And then for very unfavourable, I think Whimsicott's the one that you really don't want to face. Persian can at least try and attack against them. If you like weld as a Persian, attach and try and use like Vengeance or something, you can go down that route, maybe even try your GX attack against them. But it still feels pretty ugly. And if you're playing the pure BLACEPHALON build, you can't do anything. As soon as they put an Ultra Beast tool on, you just scoop the game. So that's one that you definitely want to try and avoid if you're ever able. Let's check out the two lists. This is my pure Naga list. It's not too dissimilar to the list I put on the channel way back. Just playing the one Naga GX. I've seen a few people try heavier counts of this. I don't really know where the space comes from, to be honest, of having a much thicker Naga GX line, but you can maybe go for like 2 copies. The thing about only playing one Naganadel GX is that you have to use his ability carefully. Usually you use it essentially on the turn B-String's activated, right? You will discard an excess Poipole, an excess Naga, or one excess Clown that you'll have in your deck as long as it's not prized. So you have the opportunity to push with Naganadel maybe 3 times a game, depending on like your prizes situation. And I think that's like good enough as a card. I think trying to get 9 cards of value out of him is already pretty good. And there are some situations where you just don't get any more Nagas out anyway, and you can have that excess Poipole and Naga as additional cards that you can discard for draw. And I think that extra draw potential is just such a big deal in Clowns, because essentially when B-Strings are activated, now we can go for our Supporter, our Dene, and a Naganadel draw, which is sometimes upwards of like 15 cards. So you should be seeing a lot of B-Strings. As soon as like if you hit your first B-String, you then thin 2 energies out of your deck, which then makes you more likely to hit B-Strings off your future draws that you go for in the turn. So I'm a big fan of the Drag Nag in this deck. It seems very good to me. Everything else is very simplistic and streamlined in the build, in my opinion. And that's why I really like it. I think it's just very close to the previous builds that we know very well. And you have that slight bit of extra gas on the B-String turns, which is a pretty good deal for you, in my opinion. Some other options you could have in here, Ninetales instead of custom catchers for gusting. I personally don't play it because the bench space gets filled up very, very quickly with this list. I'm playing a high cherishable Dedenne count. I'm playing 2 Dedenne, 3 cherish, which is higher than like most BLACEPHALON lists I see. But it does eat up a bench space at the cost of like drawing a good amount of cards. If you want to thin down the Cherishable Dedenne reliance, you can go down Ninetales potentially. Giant Hearth is a great supporter. If you want to go down to up to 4 Welder and exchange Ultra Spaces for Hearths and then make space for more treasures, that can be a route for you, which makes you less B-String reliant, which is pretty cool. And then there is that Mew3 Mag Cargo option if you want to have a better time against Shedinja. And then looking towards the Persian build is the one that I've put less time towards. So this is more of like a theory craft because I'm not certain how easy it is to try and find that Meowth in the opening turns, and that really does scare me. Like, trying to find the one of Ditto or the one of Meowth early is very worrying, because there will be some tag teams like PIKAROM, like Reshizard, and like Mewtwo. They will put you on the clock ASAP. They will try and take those knockouts quickly, and if your board isn't developed, you're going to be in trouble. And the main way this deck tries to develop its advantage is by using Persian to find B-Strings to catch up on these tag teams and sort of uptrade against them. And if you don't find Meowth or Ditto on as early as turn 1, like, that can actually just lose you the game in those matchups because you're not getting the value. Whereas if you're playing the Dragnag build, you will always have Poipoles on your board. They're so much more searchable. You have the Ultra Spaces, you have the treasures, so they're way more likely to get on board. That said, though, the upside of Persian is that you just guarantee the rings, which is insane. You're also able to play Reset Stamp, which is amazing, because that's something that the Naga build can't really afford to play. But being able to Persian to guarantee it as a one-of is a pretty big deal. So there'll still be arguments about which is the best build of Blounds. I'm kind of boring and just say that Poipole will be on the board every game, no matter what you're playing, so the Dragnag sort of fits in better with less upside. So it's like it's a constant like 7 out of 10, and then Persian is like a 10 out of 10 when it comes on the board, but it will only happen like 6 out of 10 games. So it's like if you want to weigh up super high roll against consistently drawing a bit better. So yeah, it's kind of a personal preference kind of thing. Again, for other options, the only thing you'll notice from the Persian build is that I'm not playing custom catchers. You still can try and weave in custom catchers, but with even less ball search, I get even more scared about the amount of Poipoles you can find turn 1, and it still makes it it makes it less likely that you can find that Meowth early on. So I think this build is better without customs, but I'm sure people will try and find a way to put them back in the list or find a space for the Ninetales once again. We get into number 2, and it's time for Malamar. Now, the community voted this, the highest build was the Psychic build, in at 5th place. But if you accumulate those votes, like, that's a lot of votes for Malamar in general. So I'm pretty happy at putting this at number 2. My personal favourite build is also the Psychic build, because of its simplicity and how easy it is to rinse and repeat this. Whereas the other two builds, they have better like stopping power, I guess is the best way to put it, but they are also a little bit more clunky. You have an energy split, you play a physical higher count of energies, which then eats into like your consistency cards as well. So I'm going to show off a couple lists. I'm going to show off the Psychic and the Tina Chomp build. Ultra is already on the channel as well. I actually haven't profiled Tina Chomp yet, so this will be the first time I show off a Tina Chomp build, I think. I may dedicate some more time towards individual video for that deck. But it's one that I have sort of had in the background testing, and a few of my friends are fans of the archetype as well, so something that I have had on my radar for sure. The favourables, Malamar definitely wants to see BLACEPHALON if it's either of the two top builds of Psychic or Tina Chomp, because they can try and just spam Giratinas plus spell tags. They definitely want to see Mew3 as well. My spell tag Mally is playing 1 copy of Power Plant, and that's just a free kill on a Mewtwo, which is just nuts. So even if you're like two-shotting the entire game, trying to do spell tag shenanigans, this, that, and the other, all you need is 1 turn of Power Plant, boom, you've won the game basically, which is pretty nuts. Turbo Ray I think is also pretty nice, very similar to BLACEPHALON in how the matchup will play out. BRELOOM FROSLASS I've put as favourable. Obviously my personal BRELOOM FROSLASS is heavily teched with a triple Hooper and Absol. But I think typically that matchup should be pretty good. PIKAROM, Reshizard, and Darkbox, these are all close matchups in my opinion. I've only really put this matchup spread as close because like it depends kind of which Malamar build you are. I think if you're the Psychic tag Mally, you don't want to see Reshizard, but you don't mind seeing PIKAROM, and you definitely don't want to see Darkbox. If you are a Tina Chomp Mally, you don't mind seeing any of these. And if you're Ultra, you don't mind seeing any of these either, really too much. So I think the spell tag Mally sort of has the favourables become very favourable and have these close matchups become like close to negative. I think the PIKAROM is still fine for the spell tag Mali, but the other two become a little bit more difficult, kind of reliant on things like Mimikyu to beat out reshizard and the Dark Box deck. You're hoping that you can still have enough pressure on the early game turns of like free prizes with Giratina whilst they're getting set up, but that's not always the case. And for unfavourables, I think Whimsicott's one that you don't like seeing. You basically can't use your GXs even if you are playing them against Whimsicott, and the Giratina is at best two-shotting, and whenever they're flipping heads, that's just very difficult for you, and 130 is not a difficult baseline for them to hit and maintain throughout the entire game. And there's also the SHEDINJA matchup, which is one that we can win, but I think you shouldn't expect to win that matchup, especially if they are playing Champs Festival, which I think most of them will. So yeah, I think Malamar is definitely an interesting one, and one of my top picks, to be honest. As I mentioned, most a fan of this build. This is the one that I've been playing a lot of. The pure spell tag Malamar. It's so simple and rinse and repeat that this is just a very easy archetype to play, and the spell tag is just such a strong card that it's very difficult for me to play around, to be honest. So I like this build a lot. It does really emphasize the Espeon and Deoxys heavily. We are not playing any gusting whatsoever, so the only way we can access the bench is the combination of Distortion Doors spell tags and then using Espeon and Deoxys to sweep, but oftentimes that is enough. And just the fact that this build is able to play a 5-4 Malamar line, plus 4 Bike, plus 8 Ball Search cards essentially, is what really tempts me towards this build. You can see I've weaved in the Power Plant to have a good time against Mewtwo. Also just being like a random annoying card against PIKAROMs and against a few other things to slow them down. So if you want to go more heavy down the Power Plant route, that's also something you could consider. If you want to have a better time against PIKAROM or something like that, or Dark Box as well, it can be annoying against. You can just jam an extra Power Plant in the list and it becomes even more disruptive and annoying to deal with. So that's something you could bear in mind. For other options, Dawnwing's Necrozma could be a card. I think we're already fine against BLACEPHALON, but you may want it for a bit of extra defense. And of course, its GX attack is just good against anything that's not playing Gust. You can super punish them for that by buying a free turn. Reset Stamp may be your preference over Judge. I've kind of made my standpoint with Malamar and how I like Judge in the build. And once again, if you're not a fan of Judge, Erica's Hospitality could squeeze into the list as well as a more powerful draw supporter than Judge with no disruption elements, but still pretty good. And then onto the Teenatromp Mali. This is kind of like a rendition that I've kind of just sat with, really. I haven't done too much of the build since I started testing it. I think that 2 Mew is really good in this deck because you want to try and have early pressure with something, and Mew is just a 1-energy attacker that you can also spell tag onto, and it just fits the bill very easily. You're just being able to spread spread damage counters on all sorts of things. Which then sets up the Teenatromp for 1-hit KOs. So I really like Double Mew. I think it's a good card that you can just jam in the active, just skateboard out your Jirachi attached to a Mew, spell tag onto it if you're able to find it. And with 3 copies plus Adventure Bag and Jirachi trying to Stellar Wish towards these pieces, it can be pretty reasonable, just being an annoying pressure kind of card that you have while you're trying to power up Giratina in the back on turn 2 or 3. And try and just make your opponent go through this Mew in the first case is pretty good for you. And then just set up the big 1-hit KOs. Now, this deck is not playing any Gust whatsoever. The main way that we will target our opponent's bench is with the GG End attack. If they're trying to build up something powerful in the back, you could potentially GG End and ruin their day in that regard. That GX attack is very strong. And that's the reason why I'm not playing many other GX cards, because I think the Teenatromp is just the full package. If you just happen to start with him, a 40 snipe's not bad. His main attack is solid, and his GX attack is also pretty good in some interesting situations. You can see that I've got a very similar shell to the build that I showed above, just from my preference with Malamar. The thing we have to make room for is a few extra energy cards, some fighting energies, and I'm still playing the Double Judge as disruption, but you could once again play Reset Stamp. You could play Custom Catcher if you really want to, and there's also a whole bunch of psychic attacking options that Malamar could be playing. This build also has the option to play fighting Pokemon. Things like Buzzwole could definitely improve the PIKAROM matchup. You have the headache of trying to find him and commit communications towards a Buzzwole, but it can be, once again, a huge swing. And in a similar vein, something like Marshall Machamp could be a card for a similar role. It can even get towards its GX attack in this deck because you can like attach excess psychic energies to your Martial Champ, and if you have 2 manual attachment turns of fighting energy, that's going to be nuts for you. It just hard carries the game, so Mars Champ is a reasonable addition in this deck as well. On to the number 1. I think it's pretty much like the undisputed top deck right now, and that's going to be PIKAROM. It had a huge majority of votes, and the community agree that this archetype is probably the best one going into Worlds. I think the biggest like selling point of this deck is that it just works. Like every game, PIKAROM just works, man. Obviously, if you're up against Power Plant, that's a slightly different question. But PIKAROM normally just has such good searchability for Dedenne, has a decent support account on his own end, and as soon as you get into that full blitz, the deck is working very smoothly. Oftentimes, now that Choice Band's gone and there's no Tapu Koko GX, there's no reason not to just full blitz those energies straight into play, get a lot of value out of them, tank a hit with your tag team, and then like tag switch onto something, either for a huge tag bolt or for a huge Raichu GX attack. And the archetype is just so threatening. The new edition of Raichu is genuinely so insane, and makes the archetype have a completely different dimension, and it makes it one of the highest damage output archetypes in the game right now, which is just really good. I think for favourables, I've already mentioned Reshizard when I talked about Reshizard, of course, and it's a back and forth of the stadium that's the biggest sort of headache. My build is playing Stadium Nav plus 4 Volkner plus 3 physical stadium cards, so we have a lot of outs to avoiding or getting around a power plant on turn 1, which I think is really important for Worlds. So having a high Volkner count plus a physical high stadium count plus Stadium Nav definitely helps out defend against that, which is a pretty big deal. Playing Lysander Labs really helps out against SHEDINJA as well, which is obviously something important. For close matchups, Malamar, again, you'd rather see the GX base builds rather than the tag Mali, because they are just so annoying to just continue to go through an army of Tinas when you could be going through higher prize priorities. BLACEPHALON is a close matchup. It can get out of control, but it's kind of based on their B strings and stuff. Dark Box also close. You're going to try and pressurize them early and have some things like Choo Choo waiting in the wings for them, force them to have switches on the right turns, force them to have pretty much everything going at the right time, because you're going to pressurize full blitz from turn 2 basically every game. If not, you like if you get lucky in full blitz turn 1, then you pretty much beat everything in the format right now. Whimsicott is close when you have that back and forth of the stadium versus the charm. Hopefully they're only playing 1 copy, and sometimes they only play 1 Diantha, like my build only has space for 1 right now, and maybe the one tails flip in your favor is all you need to beat that matchup. Also, they're slightly inconsistent compared to you. Turbo Ray, I think, is a close matchup. They have their bombs that can blow up in your face, which makes life difficult for you, but again, we're going to be sort of pace setting. We're a pace setting archetype, really, and we just put a lot of pressure on against them. For slightly unfavourables, you don't want to face BRELOOM for obvious reasons, and Mewtwo is an annoying attacker because of that Latios, especially because Latios 2-shots PIKAROM. It's really annoying, and there's not much we can do about that Latios, to be honest, in our build. I'm currently not playing any Zapdos whatsoever, so the Latios is even more annoying for me than anything else. You basically just wait for custom catches until you can hit something else. But yeah, that Latios is a huge pain in the neck to deal with, so just something to bear in mind. So onto my list, I've again gone away from Jirachis. It's pretty weird. For both my PIKAROM and my Mewtwo, I started off heavy Jirachi, but then I ended up like moving away from them. I think the importance of Lysander Labs is too big to say no to, and I don't like the anti-synergy of Jirachi plus Labs. So I basically have 2 opportunities. You go for Jirachi plus Viridian, or you go for Lysander Labs and just go full GX. That's the build I've gone for right now. I've kept the Rayquaza in here. He's just a very easily searchable Tapu Koko, basically, because we have the 2 Cherish Ball in addition to the comms. And he's good enough, really, for like that 1 energy opportunity, which is really good for us. There's obviously the slight worry of Stormy Winds, but I think it's worth the risk. We, as mentioned, have a very high Volkner count. I much prefer it to Lily in this format. I have a couple Lilies in here just as supplementary draw, but overall, Volkner is so insane for getting you custom catcher pieces, getting you reset stamp, getting you tag switch, he's just absolutely insane. And obviously getting you that stadium nav for the 75% of getting Thunder Mountain is a big contributing factor to how we can full blitz as well. So that card is insane. The double Choo Choo, because he's so good, pretty much mandatory against tag team matchups. That I played one for the longest time and then got stung a few times by him being prized or whatnot. So I like having 2 copies now. I'm also still playing a Mewtwo and Mew. This is another way you can get around things like Fairy Charm. This also is a way around some awkward typing. Like if they're going to try and play a Baby Buzz against you, if they're going to try and play BRELOOM against you, you can go for the Mewtwo instead, which can be pretty nice. So if you're aware of what archetype they're playing, or in like a game 2 or 3 scenario, you can go down the Mewtwo route instead, and have a different type coverage, which is pretty nice. Everything is pretty much straightforward from that point on. I'm only playing 2 Dedenne rather than 3. You could cut 1 Volkner for a 3rd Dedenne if you really want to. But I think especially when you play the Rayquaza, the bench space fills up quite a bit anyway. So it feels like you just Dedenne on turn 1 only. Sometimes, like in the late game, you'll have a final push to try and dig for like custom catches or something. But I think 2 copies is pretty much fine. And I've had to cut down to 1 reset stamp, but I definitely want to play 2 as well. So if you can find a space for a 2nd reset stamp or a 4th E-switch, those are the 2 cards that I'm really looking for in this build, because just having guaranteed access of that stamp is huge. Using it a couple times can also be just amazing. So when you have Volkner to search it out, I definitely see the value of playing more than 1 stamp. But at the moment, we're just with a 1 copy and hoping that we can find it on the right turn. But yeah, that's PIKAROM. I think it's the strongest archetype in the format right now. It can beat a lot of things just by out-consistencying them, so it's kind of like the Zoroark of the new format, basically, because it has the most draw available to it, and the most outs to draw turn 1, which is just absolutely nuts. So you have the 4 Radar, the 2 Cherish, the 2 Com, the 2 Physical Dedenne, the 4 Volkner, and then the 6 draw supporters that we play, so you really do get going quite a lot with this archetype. Yes, sometimes you sort of grind to a halt in the mid-game, then you're just using like Lily for 3 or Volkner just to go ahead and grab 1 energy and 1 like piece of a puzzle. But I think it's good enough because of the huge amount of cards you'll draw on turn 1. You have like a Night March length turn. Sometimes it can be like 10 minutes of Dedenne plus supporter plus this, that, and the other, and you get rolling. So I think the archetype's very solid, and I think it's one that you definitely have to expect for Worlds. It's obviously probably going to be like one of the top archetypes. Many people are backing it as the strongest deck, and just the deck that works the most. So I think that's something to bear in mind. For other opportunities in the deck, you could play Zapdos. As I said, it can help you get around things like Latios, which I'm currently not answering right now. Also, it can just take cheap, easy prizes against things like Jirachis or evolving basics that are just stuck in the active. Things like against Darkbox and stuff, that could be pretty nice. And Super Scoop Up's the other thing you could think about. It definitely helps out against things like the Psychic Malamar base build, because they so often are trying to set up 2-hit KOs, and you can just deny their like late game Espeon Deoxys win condition with a Super Scoop Up heads. So if you want to tech for Psychic Malamar, Scoop Up could be your nice high roll option, whilst also being, as I just mentioned, you can have that mid game of just going for like a Lily for 3 or a Volkner for 1 or whatever. And if you play Scoop Ups, it means that you could pick up your Dedenne and get a fresh 6 cards instead. So they could definitely supplement the support account in many ways. So if you want to make room for Scoop Ups, I don't hate it at all. I think it's actually pretty reasonable. So something to bear in mind for sure. Outside the top 10, there's a few other archetypes that I've considered. Now, ultimately, I think maybe like the top 8 decks that I talked about today were the ones that I greatly consider. And to be honest, the 9 and 10 spots, they could be interchangeable with some of these that are outside the top 10 right now. Obviously, we don't have results to go off of, so there's a lot to be said for these builds, but I found a few reasons why I didn't want to put these in the top 10, so I guess I'll talk about their disadvantages rather than their main core advantages to kick off. Spiritomb and Lost March, these both really struggle against Malamar. Those are basically like big reasons why I don't like the builds. If you want to, well, the Spiritomb deck does have the same kind of space as BRELOOM FROSLASS does to play that high Hooper count plus Absol, which definitely does help out. But the thing is, like, I ended up teching for Malamar, then I had to tech for PIKAROM, then I had to tech for reshizard, so Spiritomb just didn't do enough in a vacuum to be strong enough. And Jumpluff, although it does hit good damage output sometimes, it's one of those decks that can miss Elm and then just lose the game off of that alone, which is pretty bad. Beheeyem is really cool. I haven't put enough testing time to put into this list, to put this deck on the top 10. I know some people are pretty hyped on it though, and it might be like the resident sleeper deck, to be honest. I think it does have the potential to be pretty good if someone does nail a list. I imagine it will have a similar draw engine to SHEDINJA, where you just Zeb Striker away your deck as quickly as possible, because Behemoth itself stops you from decking out, because he just resets himself. So I imagine that's how it will be built. Whether it's alongside things like Aerodactyl GX to force the opponents to have more energy cards, or whether it will be alongside Mareep Sleep. It's yet to be seen, but I think Behemoth could be an archetype that you might want to have 1 or 2 games against, or at least try and craft a build yourself, because it's an interesting one for sure. Alolan Eggs is just worse than Psychic Malamar in my opinion, in terms of like what it can do and how consistently it can do it. But some people may still want to play this archetype. I don't really see a big reason why though. Beast Box is an archetype that I couldn't get working, but it's one that I still respect because it has a good amount of draw behind it. And also there's a bit of Japanese support from Porygon Z Naganadel in their format. Obviously their format's a little bit different to ours, and I don't think it translates over quite as well. That's why it's outside the top 10. Quad Keldeo was annoying for a lot of builds, and something to bear in mind, but from my testing it wasn't strong enough, especially against Malamar. And Gardevoir Sylveon, in my books, is a worse version of Whimsicott, because you're trying to do oftentimes the same things as Whimsicott, with like Fairy Charms and stuff to gain an advantage, but Whimsicott at least forces them to flip heads. Well, it forces you to flip tails at the same time, whereas Gardevoir Sylveon like just gets punched if they have answers to you. So I think I'm more of a fan of playing the Whimsicott as my fairy-based build, but some people are more excited about Guardian, which I can definitely see being reasonable, because they get to play things like Greens, which is a good supporter at the very least. That's it though, guys. Worlds is going to be really interesting. I'm still testing for the next like 14 days. The deck is going to be out on PCGO in like 2 days time, I want to say, or maybe even tomorrow. So that's going to be pretty awesome. I'm really looking forward to that. We can get back to streaming as well. It's been a while, but I'm finally set up in my new house, and that means we're going to be coming back to streaming, and I'll be streaming more than ever basically, because I want to get as much practice in for Worlds as possible. I've already been playing a good number of hours each day, and I feel like I've got a reasonable grasp on the meta, but if I missed anything today, do get it down below. Let me know what your top 10 is. Let me know what deck you're thinking of piloting for Worlds. Let me know what decks are going to be the most popular. Are you going to be teching Tapu Fini? Are you teching Mew? Are you going to be teching Magcargo? I'll hear all these things down below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I know my voice died a few times. I'm still a little bit unwell right now, but thanks for bearing with me. Sorry if I coughed or sniffed or had to take a drink at any point, but it's been a long discussion today, and I can't help myself when I'm talking about Pokemon. That's just the way it is. So I'll see you at Worlds, and also in another video tomorrow.